Right now, the first ever publicly listed project bond issued to finance a solar power plant was finalised today. The bond is valued at R1 billion and will finance the construction of a 44 megawatt utility scale concentrator. Here to tell us more on the bond is, or about the bond rather, is Kimon Boyaki, CIO at Trident Capital, and Bo McEwen, Associate Director at Deloitte & Touche. Gentlemen, thanks so much for your time. So who wants to kick this off? Kimon, shall we throw down to you in Cape Town?
Yes, good evening to you all. Hi. It is a first. I think it's notable for South Africa that we've managed to achieve this. Now, what ordinarily happens with these kinds of projects, they are project financed through the banks. And Deloitte and Trident Capital in association were the lead advisors for this particular transaction. And our foreign client is a French-based company called Soitec. Took our advice and we went the bond route. Ordinarily, as I mentioned earlier, project finance is how these things are funded. But by going the bond route, we had to do a couple of things. We got a rating from Moody's, which was important for the institutional investors locally. And secondly, what it does do to the project is actually lower the cost of capital and thereby make these kinds of projects more viable. And the third thing that we had to do was with the DOE, the Department of Energy, work within their framework and their rules. And originally when these programs were envisaged, they hadn't envisaged the funding through bonds. And thankfully they're forward thinking and supported this new form of financing. I'm going to move it to Johannesburg now, and Bo's obviously in studio. Why did Deloitte have appetite for this particular project?
Well, as Kimon mentioned, we were the lead transaction advisors in association with Trident, and I think it talks to a lot of certainly the skill set that sits within Deloitte, not only from in a corporate finance environment where we would typically raise the debt as well as the equity, but it talks to also the infrastructure and capital markets business that we have within Deloitte, where we can look at the post-financial close monitoring, we could look at the SPV administration, as well as the BE refinancing from our BE advisory business. So what it, I think, demonstrates to the market and potential clients out there is that we can potentially own the entire value chain and provide a bespoke solution on a project such as this.
Well, how much interest was there from the investor community? In other words, let me put it crudely, was this a hard sell into the South African investor base, or were they fairly receptive to it? I
think they were fairly receptive. I think, as you know, there's a lack of quality assets, and specifically in the corporate bond market. I mean, typically you can invest in credit card receivables and those sort of things. I think the challenge that we faced, well, one of the challenges that we faced was that because it's a new technology, concentrated photovoltaic, it's never been done on a utility scale globally.
Concentrated photovoltaic. I love the word photovoltaic, and I'm hoping someone somewhere along the line is going to tell us what it means. It's something to do with the sun.
Exactly. It's just it's PV. Except that the difference between this technology and normal PV is that you have ostensibly a magnifying glass that magnifies the sun's rays 500 times onto a smaller PV piece. So that is what it was. So for the technology, what we found is that because it was a new technology, we had to get a lot of the investors over the finish line with understanding it. That was probably the most critical thing.
My question would be, a lot of what we see as the green economy, as it were, isn't actually really commercially viable.
Sure.
All right. What conditions were created to make this viable from an investment risk point of view? In other words, what tax incentives are there, what subsidies are involved, etc.?
Kimon, we haven't forgotten about you in Cape Town. We're just keeping it in Joburg a little longer.
Well, I think this project lent itself to being incredibly, because it was incredibly well constructed, to being a bankable project, and that is sort of attested by the fact that Moody's gave it an investment grade rating. We received a Baa2 national scale rating for it.
We don't pay much attention to rating agencies on this show.
I know.
We like to bash them a lot.
But for a lot of investors, I think
at least they upgrade us.
Yes, exactly. But I think for a lot of investors, typically for the broader mandates, if it's got an investment grade rating, it ticks a box from that perspective. And the fact that we listed it on the JSE, so it's a tradable instrument as well, also ticks another box. So from a credit analyst perspective, they were happy with that, and then they moved on to assessing the technology and analysing the technology.
Kimon, let's get your view. Were people excited about this project? Besides having investor
I think there were a lot of There were some naysayers. There were a couple of investors who said that we were 5 years ahead of our time, as it hasn't been done before. But this is a first for us. It was good. On the other hand, there's some really astute investors out there who've got phenomenal credit teams who really applied their minds to this. Obviously, one looks at the ratings, one looks at the technology, one looks at the way this entire project was put together. We managed to a great extent to minimize the construction risk, which is something that a lot of investors had a look at. And equally importantly, I think that the yield that we issued the bond at was in line with the rating that we got for Moody's. So we listed the bond at 11%, which does reward investors for taking on a bit of risk. And in our opinion, this was probably the most bankable project of its kind in the country.
Kimon, can I just ask you, do you think this is a once-off type transaction, or do you think this is the start of more similar transactions, given that obviously South Africa needs to generate all different forms of energy? Could we see more in this area?
Absolutely. I think that it's a critical question, and this certainly opens the floodgates to this type of funding. But I must caution that not all projects would actually be able to get across the line by listing a bond. I think the nature of this particular project, the way that the paperwork was put together, the way that it was thought through and constructed, played a vital role in us getting it across the line. So to answer your question, yes, we do see this as an alternative form of funding. Certainly we're going to be seeing more of these types of transactions. But again, I must qualify that by saying that not all projects would be able to go the bond route.
Bas, you wanting to contribute to that as well?
No, absolutely. I think Kimon has hit the nail on the head there. I think the key component in this being a bankable project was the fact that, as Kimon alluded to earlier, we mitigated a lot of the construction risk by having a reversion event that was built into that, where effectively 70% of investors' cash was protected up until that reversion event. And then you only had an element of about 30% of construction risk remaining in it over a 6-month period, which investors really liked. Specifically from a bond investor's perspective, where they don't typically like to invest in greenfields, but rather any sort of a brownfields operation as well.
You've got a final question, Chris?
Just a rough indication, what's the exit price of electricity generated by this plant compared to Eskom's exit price?
Well, I mean, it's being one of the first round and preferred bidders, I mean, the tariffs were quite high. We were looking at around 261 per kilowatt hour. So it made it a bankable project. But I think the key thing that we need to realize is that as the technology improves, and with the Eskom price hikes that are going to be coming through over the next 10, 15 years.
We're all acutely aware of those Eskom price hikes.
Absolutely, yeah. It was a massive subsidy but bearing in mind that as time progresses, I think we'll get some sort of equilibrium reached as well.